Welcome to the In-Flight podcast, brought to you by the Canadian Owners and Pilots Association, the podcast for all things general aviation in Canada. Hello and welcome to the COPA In-Flight podcast. My name is George Farrington and I am the Director of Advocacy and External Affairs at COPA. Today we're asking the question, what got you into aviation? What ignited the spark? Was it something that was always in the family, or did you have an event during your childhood that got you inspired that has now led to a lifelong passion? We have a call-in from a member. We have some excerpts from the latest edition of the COPA Flight magazine, and we have an excellent letter that was originally addressed to snowbirds that talks about the inspiration that they provided to a gentleman's aviation journey. We start with a call-in from a COPA member who recounts his first aviation experience all those years ago.
Over 70 years ago, I was in grade 6, and my dad showed up at the school and drove me to Toronto Island Airport. There, a friend of his from the war had flown in from the States in a Bonanza V-tail. Well, we got in, flew around Toronto, and I was hooked. I've been flying ever since.
That was an excellent story that just goes to show how a small moment in one's childhood can have such an impact on one's aviation journey later on in life, and how a small experience can grow to a lifelong passion. We now have an excerpt from Nicolas Janho's story, My Path to a PPL, which is featured in the November-December 2025 Discover Aviation issue of the COPA Flight magazine. Nicola writes, My passion for aviation began when I was 14. While most of my friends were excited about cars or sports, I was drawn to something more intricate, the elegant complexity of a jet engine. Its precise engineering and the sheer power it could generate seemed almost magical. That early curiosity grew as I got older, with the help of Microsoft Flight Simulator and an enthusiastic online community of real and aspiring pilots. I started to explore aviation fundamentals in a serious way. I was not just playing a game, I was studying flight dynamics, learning checklists, and trying to understand lift, drag, thrust, and the subtle ways they interacted. At 16, I experienced flight for the first time during a short glider ride. It lasted only 15 minutes, yet it left a deep impression. Feeling the G-forces, hearing the quiet rush of air around the canopy, and sensing how the aircraft responded to every movement showed me that flying was not simply an interest. This is an excellent story that shows something as accessible as Microsoft Flight Simulator can start that spark and can grow into a passion for flight. Another useful avenue for those looking to get into aviation from a young age is the cadets that offer both glider and powered flight training. Now we have an outstanding excerpt from an aerobatic champion, and when he has a little bit of free time, also a flight instructor, Luke Penner, whose story From Grasshopper to the World Stage is featured also in the Discover Aviation issue of the Flight magazine. Luke writes, Some kids grew up on a farm. I grew up at an airport. My parents started Halves Air in 1972, and what began as my dad, one instructor, and one airplane has grown into more than 40 instructors and nearly 40 airplanes. Even with that kind of immersion in aviation, flight school, life, aviation museums, and yearly pilgrimages to Oshkosh, I never believed flying was something I could actually achieve. For fear of failing, I buried any real interest in aviation. Luke continues, that lasted until I was 21. By then we had a 1943 Taylorcraft L2 Mike Grasshopper, a pure, joyful little tube and fabric tail dragger with a Continental 0170 making all of 65 horsepower. My dad offered me a no-strings-attached flight in Charlie Golf Charlie Echo Romeo one day in 2003, and everything changed. I was so absorbed by the freedom and purity of flight that I forgot to feel unworthy or not smart enough. I soloed that little airplane in about 7 hours, and my world opened up in ways I couldn't have imagined. Another excellent story from a world champion, a man whose life is dedicated to aviation, either competing in aerobatics, teaching aerobatics, a champion both in Canada and in the world, who believed that flying wasn't achievable. He grew up in an aviation environment with a father and a flight school. It's one of the largest in Canada now. just really goes to show how such a small moment like flying in something as rudimentary as a tailorcraft and learning the joy of basic principles of flight of stick and rudder can really have an effect on what ended up becoming an incredible career. Finally, we have a letter sent to us by Tony Hindle. Tony originally sent this letter to the Snowbirds team in 2022, but he thought it speaks quite well to how his passion for aviation became a flying reality. Tony talks about how years ago, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, the Snowbirds flew across Canada as part of Operation Inspiration, and his home of London, Ontario was to be one of those stops. Now, the originally planned day of May 9th of 2020 was unfortunately too bad weather-wise for a flight. However, the flight occurred on the 10th of May, at which point Tony stepped outside, looked up, and saw what he described as an incredible formation of the Big Diamond fly right overhead his shop. Now, that was inspiration in itself, and Tony spent the following week researching flight schools, watching videos, and trying to convince himself that a private pilot's license was within his reach. Unfortunately, a week later, on May the 17th, 2020, a tragedy struck with the unfortunate passing of Captain Jennifer Casey in Kamloops. Now, this was devastating news for the entire country, but for Tony, this meant an awful lot more. He dedicated his training to Captain Casey and used her unfortunate passing as motivation for him to finish his pilot's license, which he completed on April 28th of 2022. Now, Tony writes to Captain Casey that we never met, but that day that you flew over my shop, you inspired me. Please know that you have made an incredible difference in my life. I give thanks to you every time I fly, and I will never forget your sacrifice. It's a perfectly unique story, and once again shows the sheer range of what gets people into aviation, what sparks that passion, and what pushes you over the edge to undertake the training and start your flying journey. Myself, I grew up on a small island off the coast of the UK, and we would fly to and from the island in Twin Otters and Islanders with an open door between the passengers and the crew. And from a young age, I would watch them undertake some impressive landings in strong crosswinds and questionable weather. And that really showed how possible it was, how within reach it could be to be able to fly, to watch them fly the aircraft and know that with a little bit of training and a little bit of dedication, I too could undertake that flying, and push me to start my training at 17 and achieve my pilot's license, my private pilot's license, and I've been flying ever since. Thank you to all that submitted your stories for this podcast. If you have a talking point or something you'd like to be featured on the podcast, we have a phone number where you can leave your name and number and your message. That number is 613-651-4289. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the COPA In-Flight podcast. Find us on our social media and join us for the next episode.